Hello and welcome to another episode of the Property Trio. Today I'm joined with Cate as Dave is still on leave, but we've got a listener question today that fits right into the pocket for Cate, so we shouldn't miss Dave too much, although he always adds something. Cate, welcome.
Yeah, great to be seeing you. And someone had a special day yesterday. Happy birthday, Mike Mortlock.
Thank you. Another lap around the sun.
Yeah.
It's it's the grey hairs that I'm accumulating at a rate of knots. I think
Oh,
I've reached
stop
that
it.
tipping point.
Stop
Anyway,
it.
let's hear from listener Brooke, who's got a really, really good question. It starts with, "Is Ballarat a no-go?" That's a strong
Yeah.
start. I think we could probably say that it's not a no-go, and go to the pub and call that lunch. But there's a bit more meat on the bones. She's asking about long-term growth because she's interested in buying there with the profits from their Perth property. Well done. Perth did 19% in 2024. And of course, if you bought it earlier than that, you would have had even more upside. She's
Yeah.
trying to stay under 690K and wants to buy regional Victoria, but not in the big smoke of Melbourne. It interests Brooke because they're happy to live in the property potentially for a few years. So, Cate, this is obviously your sweet spot for a number of reasons. Obviously, you're a big advocate of the Victorian regions and you do transact quite a bit in Ballarat. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, you were there yesterday.
Yeah.
And secondly, Brooke has mentioned investing and living in Ballarat for a few years. So let's start with that first one. Is Ballarat on the cards for an investor in your view?
Yeah, definitely. It's completely not a no-go. Ballarat's great, but for good reason. And Brooke nailed that reason in a short question. She wanted to target regional and not the big smoke of Melbourne. And with $690,000, if you're targeting the big smoke and you want a house on its own block of land, you are going to be in the fringe. There's no doubt about it. And they will be lower socioeconomic demographic areas. If you take that money into Ballarat, you will be able to pick quite a lot of more blue chip areas, and you'll be able to get gorgeous houses, typically character properties, Victorians, Edwardians, they're very pretty. So it's a good budget for Ballarat and separates you from units as well if you're wanting to be close to the city, because 690 in Melbourne, that'll get you a unit in a good spot. But a lot of people don't want units. So I think that it's definitely a goer. And when we have a look at Ballarat's population, its population growth, the flavour of the city, the industry, there's a lot there actually. So I shouldn't just word vomit all of that. I should let you talk me through it, and we can circle on each segment because Ballarat has a lot on offer.
Yeah, well, so Ballarat, I remember going there as a little kid
To Sovereign Hill.
to Sovereign Hill, and
Yeah.
I was sure I was going to strike my fortune there as a 5-year-old or something. Had a little
You would
bit
have
of a
got a little
gold
bit of
pan.
gold that was sprinkled into the river.
Can't really remember. So obviously it wasn't a huge big haul, but Ballarat obviously was a huge economic and I suppose population centre during the gold rush period. But I'm interested in, for someone who hasn't been there since being a child, like what are the drivers? What is pulling people to live there? Because as you say, the population's growing. I assume it's not about gold anymore. Must be
Mm.
quite. There must be quite a lot in it for people to want to relocate, especially from Melbourne to Ballarat, as we've seen people doing.
Yeah, well, let's start with its history because I think that put it on the map. It was a very wealthy and influential city during the Victorian gold rush, and that was in the 1850s. It was known for its high gold yields and, rapid influx of wealth. And you can see it when you go there. Ballarat's been very fortunate that not many of its beautiful provincial buildings have been mowed down, and it's a very glorious city. That city grid when you go down Sturt Street, it's really impressive, and you can do like walking tours. And I mean, I'm a massive rat for Ballarat because I enjoy just going there for a long weekend as well. It's very, very cold. You're quite elevated, and in winter you can get a little bit of snow. It's unusual, but it's exciting. Um, and everywhere you go, you want to have really good heating. So Ballarat's not necessarily an easy place for those who don't like the cold, but it's beautiful. And so what's happened with Ballarat is, when I started shopping there 15 years ago, its population had hit 100,000. It's up to 122 now, and it's growing. And it's not just an organic growth. It's been earmarked as an area that is destined for growth. And so we're seeing, from a visa point of view, it's attracting a lot of skilled migrants. It's got a hospital. It's actually got two hospitals, the St. John of God and the Ballarat Base Hospital, and they're big. And they are home for trainee doctors as well. You get a lot of medicos that are on contract. And it's also an education city. So some of the really premium high schools in our state are in Ballarat. You've got Clarendon College and Ballarat Grammar and Loretto, St. Patrick's. I'm just reeling them all off. I'm thinking about driving down that Avenue of Honour, and all the private schools are there with their big, beautiful gates. So Ballarat definitely is a draw card for a lot of people that are either in the education or health sector, but that's not all it does. It's also a manufacturing centre, and I've had a lot of people laugh at me about that, but McCain's, Mars, our train carriages, bricks, there's a bit going on in Ballarat from an industry, education and health point of view. So jobs are there, and it's diversity that's certainly the word that I use for Ballarat. So it is continuing to grow. It's been earmarked as an area to continue growing. From an urban planning point of view, you can see that urban sprawl of Ballarat also. So there's plenty going on. And the thing that I think separates it from a lot of other regional towns and cities around Australia is its proximity to the big smoke. I got to Ballarat yesterday in an hour and 5 from Yarraville, which is not unusual.
That's good going.
They've had roadworks for many, many years. And yesterday I just got lucky. I only went through 2 bursts of roadworks. When you've got plenty, it can slow you down and add 15 minutes to your trip, but that's still a pretty good commute. And if you jump on a train at Southern Cross Station and jet up to Ballarat, you can be there on an express train in 64 minutes. So, high-speed trains, lots of services, and plenty of commuters too, not necessarily full-time commuters, but maybe hybrid workers. So Ballarat has been a popular choice for a lot of people. And then I've mentioned it on the show before, during COVID, it had enormous growth, unprecedented and really crazy in that short period of time, because it's within 2 hours, and that tended to be that psychological travel distance that a lot of people were prepared to navigate. So unlike Bendigo, which is a little bit further, they're two very similar cities. They've got very similar housing, similar size of the city, but Ballarat's population is only about 10,000 more than Bendigo. Bendigo is a gold rush city as well, but Ballarat's closer. So, there's some of the reasons why it's continued to have a growing population, and it's continued to perform.
Yeah, I just bunged into Google Maps Melbourne to Ballarat, and I got 117 k's in an hour and 32 minutes. Now, that's probably due to traffic in the morning this morning or something like that. But you're saying just over an hour. So
I'm in Yarraville, so I'm on the western side of town, and that certainly helps, because if I was trying to get from the city to Yarraville, that'd be, right
wasted
now.
20 minutes already.
Yeah, 20 minutes, yeah.
So, because I was going to ask, is that a commutable distance, which you sort of answered that, there probably would be some people that would commute every day, but it is such a distance that it lends itself to more of a hybrid sort of thing. But to me, I've always been quite fascinated in those markets that are within that sort of hour and a half to 2 hour proximity of a capital city. And I often kind of think about Wollongong, Sydney, Newcastle, Sydney, and maybe even Central Coast to Sydney as having a similar influence to Ballarat with Melbourne. And what typically we see in places like Newcastle is that it tends to get momentum on the back of a Sydney boom. It's just probably 3 to 6 months behind. And it makes me sort of ask the question to you. With Melbourne at the moment really starting to be on the upswing, we've been talking about it on this show for probably a year now. It's been in the doldrums for quite some time. It's really done nothing compared to every other capital city since the beginning of COVID, but it now seems to be having its time in the sun and could be a really strong performer for 2025. Is there an opportunity for people to sort of, that are a little bit worried about their next move and dipping their toe in the water by just watching Melbourne? And if Melbourne does have that kick, there is an opportunity in Ballarat, or is it far more complicated than that, do you think?
Not complicated, and this show's all about Ballarat, but I need to introduce the G word, and that's Geelong. I think that Geelong is more like Newcastle and Wollongong to Sydney as Geelong is to Melbourne. Ballarat's beautiful, and you will always get someone who, from an affordability and lifestyle point of view says, you know what, I'm going to vote Ballarat. But typically the market that follows Melbourne a little more closely, mirrors it a little bit, is Geelong. And, Geelong's been on the rise in a sensational kind of way since the closure of the Ford factory, which was counter to what everyone was fearful about.
Yeah.
We could do another show on Geelong. I love the place as well. Ballarat is quite different though, because it is a smaller city. It is much colder, and there's a demographic trend that's taken place in Ballarat, and Bernard Salt pointed it out. I went up to a presentation that he held in Ballarat in the Civic Hall. It was such a great prezzo, but he was identifying that they've lost a lot of 20 to 30-year-olds in Ballarat, or 20 to 40-year-olds, and so that graduate age or that high school leaver age, they tend to do their education in Ballarat and then disappear and work somewhere else and then return to Ballarat when they're a little bit older, and that's a challenge for Ballarat to overcome. And I get to work with a few people, like a handful of people, that say to me, I'd love to return or go to Ballarat. I'd love to live there, and can you help us find our forever home? But I could count those people seriously on two hands over 15 years that have done that, outside of the crazy COVID surge. The people that have worked out a plan for themselves and said, we want to raise our kids in Ballarat, and that's the lifestyle for us. Because I think I've said cold about 4 times now, but cold climate is not for everyone.
And when a Melburnian says cold, it's different to, say, someone from Brisbane saying cold, right? You've got to take it more seriously.
Yeah, it can be bitter in winter.
So getting back to the question from Brooke, we've established that Ballarat is not a no-go. She asked the questions about long-term growth, and I'm interested in your suggestions in and around her kind of price point. Is that a sufficient price point where there should be some value for money? You mentioned it's putting you into blue chip territory, but what does that look like from a long-term growth perspective?
I think it holds you in good stead. You've always got to look at a median price of a house in an area, in any given area, and work out which side of the median you're on. And if you're in the lowest quartile, that can sometimes spell social trouble. I think 690 would go a long way. I could comfortably spend $1 million in Ballarat, and I have, before I had a client only a few months ago that bought an absolutely superb Victorian family home with a wraparound balcony and big land. It was absolutely stunning. It was on that street that's near the train station. It was really beautiful. But 690 still gets you a character property on a decent block of land in a good area. I've seen a lot of activity in Ballarat of late. We've got quite a few large advocate firms from interstate who have jumped onto it like a seagull to a chip. And their budgets are sub 500, and they're looking for houses. And even, sub 450, sub 420 for a house in Ballarat, it can be done, but I wouldn't be choosing that. I would sooner go for a well-located townhouse than try and buy a house for sub 420. And the reason for that is, like any city, it's got its pockets. And there's one particular pocket that, I'm well aware of a lot of people targeting of late, investors from interstate. And these advocates they're not inspecting themselves. They're actually buying sight unseen and quite a few of them are relying on the real estate agent to do a quick video.
Mm.
Some of these areas, property managers don't want to manage properties in these areas. So I think it's not for the faint-hearted investing in Ballarat. You need to know your market. You need to know where some of the really tough social areas are, and you need to understand what sort of tenant experience or landlord experience you'll be having, and whether you've got property managers that are up for the task. But 690, it clears you well and truly from that dilemma.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's something that we've spoken about a couple of times on the show, is getting in touch with property managers in a particular location that you're looking at and saying, look, what's in demand? What sorts of properties? Is it 3 bedrooms? Is it 4 bedrooms? Is it houses? Is it apartments? But also they're going to know the horror stories of the locations, right, where they want to avoid. And property management is a fairly competitive industry. And if property managers are not wanting to take on a management in a certain area, it's a bloody good clue that it's just not worth their while with the headaches and the pain that it comes with managing that, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned, knowing where the demand is. In Ballarat, there's demand everywhere, but you don't want to go where there's demand from tenants that are just going to give you a massive headache. And that's very judgmental of me to say, but you don't want police calls on the weekend. You don't want, domestic situations that are involving the police. You don't want damaged properties or rent not being paid. That it's a fair thing for me to say. Every investor would be hoping to avoid those challenges.
Yep.
And vacancy rates are pretty tight in Ballarat. And even though it's a very cold city and you do get a bit of a cyclic change with your rental demands, if you're trying to lease something in the very middle of winter, you might need to wait a few more days than if you're leasing it in a warmer month. And of course, it's a city that attracts people on contract. So you can imagine January is a really busy month for property managers. In fact, they don't take breaks in Jan because that's when they're really, really busy. It's a university town as well. So if you're in the southern part of Ballarat, Fed Uni is down south in Mount Helen, and it sounds like it's miles away, but it's a 12-minute drive into the CBD, and you'll get a lot of demand all over town. The students don't necessarily just want to live down in Mount Helen and Mount Clear. They're happy to live all over. So you've got pretty strong rental yields as well, stronger than Melbourne, tight vacancy rates. Lots of university graduates or undergraduates that are bolstering the demand. I'm not suggesting that uni students make great tenants, but when you've got lots of people all wanting property at one time, it means that you can probably take your pick with your tenants. And, we've got a really strong health sector with great quality tenants in terms of, higher incomes, doctors who are busy at work all day, probably less wear and tear on the property. Other contract work, we've got government services up there which haven't really touched on, emergency services, so 000, Vic Roads, NDIS, Consumer Affairs Victoria. We've got a place in the heart of the city on Mare Street called GovHub, and apparently it's got 1,000 desks. So there's a lot of work going on and a lot of it's contract. So if you can talk to your property manager about timing it right, you can try and lease your property when demand is optimal.
Interesting. I was going to ask you about the rental yields and the vacancy rate. So obviously everywhere is fairly tight for vacancy, and you said there's a lot of demand in Ballarat. Rental yields typically in Melbourne are better than some other capital cities, but in Ballarat even better than Melbourne. I'm interested in let's remove the rental kind of crisis that we're in. What is kind of like the long-term yield differential between Melbourne and Ballarat, and is there a meaningful difference in vacancy when it's, say, a softer tenancy market?
Well, when I first started buying in Ballarat, you could easily get 5% gross rental yield back in 2011, 2012. And as prices continued to grow and Victorian rents didn't really move, I mean, Pete Kalizos has talked about that for a long time. Lately, we've been playing catch up. Ballarat yields slipped back down to closer to 4.2%. And now you'll only really get 5% if you're buying a unit. If you're buying a house, it should start with a 4, unless it's a house that's like $1 million property. It will probably then be in the high 3s. So, yeah, it's higher. But you won't get a drastically lower rental if you're renting during winter. In fact, you might not get a lower rental, but you may have a vacancy. So the rents hold reasonably firm. And they went crazy during COVID, but they hold reasonably firm. I haven't seen Ballarat rental tank, but obviously as prices went up, rental yields declined.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. So Brooke's actually kind of spoilt for choice if she's looking for a Victorian region, right? Because you mentioned
Mm.
Geelong. I saw a post yesterday that showed the actual listings have grown quite a lot in Geelong, which looks to me like there's some headwinds. But we also have Bendigo and a host of other regions, perhaps not with the same amount of population, but is Ballarat your pick of the options for Victorian regional investment?
No, it's one of many. I love the regions. You've got to make sure that you match as an investor, you're matching your budget to the outcomes that you're wanting. You're looking at growth, you're looking at yields, you're looking at vacancy rates, demographic, long term plans. And I think for the 690 budget, Ballarat's a great option. One of a few, but it's a great option because Brooke will be able to buy something in a pretty good location, and it will be a house that they'll be proud of, and if they're living there, which they've talked about, and we'll discuss that soon. It will probably be something with a pretty good interior, and it's got period charm. So Ballarat is just one, but getting around the city is great. It's easy. The train services are good, roads are good. As I said earlier, industry is diverse. It's a friendly city. I think it's great, and you've got Melbourne at your fingertips if that's what you want, and you've got some really lovely rural centres around you as well. So Ballarat gives you that really glorious mix of rural life and a provincial city as well. You don't have to be right in the heart of town.
What happened to the gold? Is it all
It's
dug out,
still
or is it still
there.
there?
Not at all. Gold mining still takes place in Ballarat,
Really?
and there's hallmarks of all of that. You can see in contracts of sales. Sometimes they'll have a map with overlays, or they'll have mine shafts disclosed in
Right.
proximity to the property. And years ago there was something in the news about a house that looked like it had gone into a sinkhole, and what had happened is a mine shaft had collapsed. But there is still mining activity. I think viability of mines is a big thing for gold rush areas, because you've got to question the business cases, obviously questioning whether the cost of running the mine is viable in terms of what you get out of the mine. But it's got a rich history of gold, and yeah, still the gold is still there.
I was thinking small scale, Kate. I was thinking once Dave gets back, we'll go up there and we'll get into one of the rivers and set up one of those little sluicing funnels. Get Dave on the shovel. I don't need much, but a couple of
Oh,
little nuggets.
I'll just take you to Sovereign Hill, and then we'll go to a pub afterwards. Be lots of fun. See the
Probably
gallery,
scratch that
go to the
cost
Eureka
of thinking.
Stockade. It'd be great.
Good, excellent. Okay, so back to Brooke. She said
Yeah.
she's interested in buying with profits from the Perth house. I'm interested in that
Mm.
one. So I know that there are a few commentators that were suggesting Perth is one of those places where they actually have an exit plan. They're buying at a certain point and suggesting they exit because they don't feel confident about the long-term growth. I wonder if this is Brooke selling a property, or do you think maybe she's using that equity uplift to jump into the next one?
Do you know what? I couldn't quite work it out. And we should have gone back to Brooke and asked that. But I thought, for the purposes of having a good discussion, we could discuss both scenarios on this show.
Mm,
Because if they've sold in Perth and they're looking at moving to Ballarat, there's quite a few considerations and tips that I would give them. But if they're looking at using their equity, um, that's not unusual. I've had a lot of investors over the last year from Perth who are using their equity.
yeah.
The real thing that but the prevalence of Perth investors is not lost on anyone. A little bit surprising that they're circling Ballarat, because a lot of people from interstate want a piece of the big smoke. But I do want to chat about Brooke's mention of living in Ballarat for a few years. There's
Yes.
two questions there. Are you wanting to do that because you've decided that you'd like a piece of Victorian regional life, in your story? Or is it something that you've been planning for a long time? Or are you looking at this investment and trying to fit in the opportunity or the option to live in it one day when it's not really a likely outcome. Because if it's the latter, I would argue that an investor that wants to buy something for investment purposes and then maybe live in it really muddies the water.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that. And in fact, I might advocate for something that you agree with, but I'll ask you to be speaker one for the negative, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure.
I actually kind of think there's two reasons why people buy an investment with an idea of that it's an investment sort of live-in hybrid. One, I think, is that they're thinking, well, okay, well, we probably don't want to move there for 10 years, but if we get in now, the prices are cheaper. We might not be able to afford it later. But see, the thing is, if they're constricting themselves to something that ticks both boxes, i.e. an investment property that they wouldn't want to live in could be potentially a better investment. At the end of the time when they're wanting to move in, they've got an asset that would have grown in more value anyway. And I feel like when you're asking an asset to do things, two things, there's a compromise, right? It might be 90% as good as any investment property, but you've got to leave that extra bit for the, okay, well, we don't want to live in this street, or we want this amount of bedrooms. Firstly, do you agree? And if you do, how difficult is it to be speaker one for the negative?
There's two reasons I believe that people have that goal to, maybe I want to live in it, and you've nailed it. So I'm agreeing on that. But let's talk about the reasons. One, I think Stuart Weems described it as live vesting, and it's the idea of nailing your future home earlier than you want it, and putting your capital into that and letting capital growth do its thing. And then obviously it relies on you downsizing at some point in the future. The other reason why people do it is hedging their bets, and it's because they're feeling quite uncomfortable about investing, and they're fearful of the unknown and fearful about what it could mean for them economically. And I've heard people say, oh, well, worst case scenario, I could live in it. If everything goes wrong, or if I lose my house in Melbourne, or if whatever. And I don't think that's a good way to look at investing at all, because you're trying to get something that should be a well thought out pure investment to be a bit of a hedge as well. And if you're not going to be happy there living in it, if you don't know the area, all you're doing is overlaying your own personal requirements that might not be investment-centric requirements. I've had people saying, oh, it's got to have a patio because I've got a dog or whatever. Well, that's unraveled what could have been a really great assignment, because they've got their own personal preferences for something that is not likely to happen. So I think it's very important that when people are looking at investing, wherever it is, not just Ballarat, that they're really clear on whether it's for them in the future or whether it's probably not. If it's probably not, why don't you just make it definitely not, and just go for something that ticks all of the investment boxes so that you get the optimal performance out of the asset.
I love that. I'm going to call you speaker 2 and 3 for the affirmative.
But let's talk about, I want to do this justice, because it sounds like Brooke might have genuinely thought about a 3-year, whether it's a sabbatical in Ballarat or whether that's just, a stage of their life that they genuinely want to move to Ballarat. If you're thinking of doing that and you're coming from a place far, far away and you're not super familiar with Ballarat, I've actually got some tips. So the first one is try it before you buy it. That might mean book an Airbnb in the middle of winter for 2 weeks and see how you feel. Yep. Take the family on a holiday.
Get a bit of frostbite with the family.
Yeah, well, see how you feel. Or go in summer. It can be really hot in Ballarat as well. It's not just all about heaters, it's about aircon units too. Try before you buy. The next one is check out the schools if you've got kids or you're planning kids, because you do want to make sure that you're picking the right school for you and your kids, and you're in a location that is supportive of that school. Warmth is a big one. So test how you feel about being cold and make sure that whatever you're selecting has great heating options, that you're ready for being outdoors in the cold climate. And also think about the risks associated with jumping out of your current market and into Ballarat. Because if this is a longer term play, or if you're just doing 3 years in Ballarat, you want to make sure that you're not eroding your chances of buying back into a capital city. Ballarat's growth has been great, but it hasn't been exactly the same as Melbourne. So if your preference is to have a bit of time in Ballarat and then sell and move into a bigger market, you might find that you're eroding your own capital. So the other thing I'd say is 3 years is not long enough, in my view, to make a purchase decision unless it's going to be a property that you live in for 3 years, but you hold it.
Yeah.
I always like to think that tenure will be at least 10 years. That makes a lot more sense than selling in a period that's shorter than that, doing your stamp duty, doing your agent's fees, your marketing costs, all of that stuff. You're just eroding your profit.
Mm. Yeah, look, very, very sagely advice. And that is a bit of a concern, especially if you are going from another more expensive location, you're getting into a smaller asset. Yes, it's great to have a lesser mortgage, but if you are wanting to go back there, it's a little bit difficult, right? It's like retiring in Bali as a billionaire, but it doesn't suit your lifestyle, so you want to move back to Sydney. It's like, ouch.
Yeah, absolutely. You've just got to get it right. We've seen a lot of COVID escapades find that coming back to the city, selling their place down in wherever, whether it's Warrnambool, Bright, Echuca, whatever, it's been a tough acknowledgement for them to see that Melbourne has bounced back, and that some of these coastal markets, particularly when there was a surge during COVID, might have lost a bit of ground.
Mm.
And it's always upsetting seeing that what you could trade with, you can no longer trade with.
Well, before we sort of tie a bow around Ballarat for Brooke as an investment location that has legs, you mentioned after our brief prospecting trip with Dave going to the pub, but you've actually got a little fun fact about the drinking scene in Ballarat.
Yeah, well, there's over 50 pubs in Ballarat, and some of them are lots of fun, and they've all got their own flavour, and really old pubs all around the city, not just in the CBD. But interesting, during the height of the gold rush, Ballarat had over 500 pubs, and it was known as Pub Town.
That's fantastic. We need to go to Pub Town.
We do. Yeah, the students love it. I remember going up there years ago when I went to Monash Uni, and I had mates at school who got into Ballarat Uni, and they had an O week that was a bit earlier than our O week. So for uninitiated, O week is orientation week, and it's where first year students get initiated into the university scene, and it's usually involving lots of silly activities and drinking and pub crawls, and super fun. Ballarat's O week was the most fun O week I've ever had.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I've just done the quick maths calculation on that. That's one pub for every 2,240 people. So if you've got a suburb that you want to pitch in the battle against the drinking prowess of Ballarat, then send it through. But if that number's 500, we're talking one pub for every 240 people.
Imagine that.
Which is absolutely crazy. And during the gold rush, the population may have swelled to more than that. I don't know. Do you have historical info on that?
Nearly 60,000 people by 1858.
60,000.
By 1859, a smaller number of permanent settlers, around 23,000, had established a more stable, prosperous economy. Great question, and we could go into the history of Ballarat and gold mining licenses and the Eureka Stockade, but we'll save that for another day.
Well, that's one pub for every 120 people, which is just crazy.
Assuming that every single resident is at the pub.
I know, at one time, yeah. I mean, obviously somebody had to be panning for gold, right?
Oh, and what about, all of the kids that can't go to the pub and the oldies that have had enough of pubs? It could be like 40 people per pub. That just sounds crazy, doesn't it?
It does. But anyway, I want a slice of that. So what else do you think Brooke really needs to know to have the confidence to go to the next level in terms of looking for the right property in and around that price point? So she's got $690 to spend. We know that that's likely to get her a house, and a quality house. You can spend more, but that puts you in a good pocket. She's got profits from Perth, either equity or she's sold something, and is looking for long-term growth with the possibility of maybe dual purpose, but maybe we've talked her out of that. I don't know.
No, and I don't want to talk Brooke out of it, because that would be an amazing life chapter to spend it in Ballarat. But if that's their goal, and given how invested they are in Ballarat, the first thing that I'd recommend they do is have a look at what's selling. You can you can just look on the sold tab. If nothing else, you can chat to some local agents. You can keep an eye on the market and track when things are selling. And if the prices are undisclosed, just reach out. The agents are very friendly. But I would actually invest in getting to Ballarat. I'd book a flight to Melbourne, hire a car, go up there, stay for a weekend, a week, a fortnight, whatever it is. I'd get out there and see properties. It's not really an auction-centric town, not very much. There are a few auctions. The higher priced properties tend to go to auction. And I would get out there and pound the pavement, meet the agents, talk to some property managers, explore the various pockets. Ballarat's got quite a lot of suburbs. You could be down south near the uni. You could be, around the lake. Lake Wendouree is the most expensive pocket of Ballarat, followed by Soldiers Hill. You could check out Wendouree itself, which was an interesting pocket that thrived during the Melbourne Olympics. So 1950s is when Wendouree was constructed. Wendouree West is a little pocket to the west of that housed the rowers on the lake. And that now is a really tough area from a socio-economic point of view. But there's the new areas that are emerging to the west of the lake. And then you've got the eastern side, which, catches all of the traffic coming in on Victoria Street off the freeway from Melbourne. There's lots of facets to Ballarat and lots of different eras around the place, ranging from, 1950s all the way back to the late 1800s. It's very beautiful. And you've just got to identify which part of the city might be for you if you're moving there. And if you're just investing and not moving there, I'd certainly have a really good chat with some good property managers.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome advice. So hopefully that ticks off all the questions from Brooke. Thank you for your question, Brooke. And if you're listening and you have a question about real estate, anything to do with property in Australia, ping those through to us. You can find the contact details through the website or the Facebook group. Cate, now it's time for our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
I've got a quick little gold nugget for anyone who's a bit inquisitive about this Ballarat place, and especially if you're a Victorian. You can have some nice weekends away in Ballarat, even just a one night stay. I'm full of lots of ideas, but it's had an interesting dining scene that really emerged during COVID. And if you're staying in the city grid, everything's within walking distance. If you feel like jumping on a train from Southern Cross, it's a pretty quick commute. And you can have a bit of fun on foot. Walking around the lake is another idea. You don't just need to do a city walk. And you need to pre-book some of these restaurants if you're wanting to have a bit of a degustation experience. There are some nice pubs around the place. There's a really fun one called Auntie Jack's, and they've got beer distillery activity going in there, and they've got like lots of old TVs and radios and stuff stacked around the place. It's got a really eclectic feel. So I sound like I'm a supporter of Ballarat. I absolutely am, but explore it, have a weekend there. If nothing else, you've had a nice weekend away, and pretty cost-effective one at that.
And I just wanted to share, we were talking about making an investment dual purpose. If you're looking for something that you want to buy as an investment, but maybe moving into it, we both kind of spoke against that as the most pure and effective strategy. However, you kind of pulled me up to say, like, no, I'm not necessarily talking Brooke out of it, because I took my very militant viewpoint. That's always a bad idea. But you were right to say that, because life is also a thing that happens to us. We aren't just ones and zeros on an Excel spreadsheet, as much as I like to think that could be the case as a bit of a data nerd. But it is important that the property serves your purpose and it fits to what you're actually trying to achieve. I think we do raise a very valid point that if you are asking it to do two particular things, like your example where it needs to have a patio because of the dog, well, that could actually limit the prospects for getting the best investment property. And most of us are wanting to just get the maximum result, the maximum growth that we can, and the best cash flow and all those sorts of things. But it does have to fit within your lifestyle as well. And there's nothing innately wrong with that.
Yeah, nicely said.
All right. Well, that was Ballarat. Thank you, Brooke. And thank you very much, Cate. And we'll see you next week.
I think we've got a Darwin one coming up. I can't wait to unpack Darwin. And Dave has gone away on holiday and gone, but don't do Darwin without me. So we look forward to his input on our Darwin app as well.
Excellent. And Darwin, I mean, if we look at the results from last month, it's actually leading the nation for capital growth. There's a lot of eyeballs there. I'm hearing that there are some buyers agents there. And when people are asking the question, as they have been, about where is the next Perth, some people are putting their hand up to say Darwin is the likely candidate. So we are going to agree, debunk, debate that in detail. So
We are
definitely don't miss
indeed.
that one.
Yeah, can't wait.
Cheers.
I'll see you next week.